now almost 2 months since the people of this country began to put up with restrictions on their freedom, your freedom.
Hey there, and welcome to this TLDR news video. Yesterday evening, Boris Johnson spoke to the people of Britain and outlined the UK's future and how the country will be relaxing the lockdown. In this video, we'll summarise exactly what he said, explain the government's logic, and let you know when things may return to normal. Before I dive in, I just wanted to let you know that all of our pin badges are now back up in stock, including our 4th series of badges, which includes the likes of England, Ireland, Finland, Poland and Bulgaria. And because we're now fully back in stock, all of the badges you order will be shipped immediately, so no pre-orders or delays. Check out our store for more information, and the first 25 orders of any items will get 10% off using code ANNOUNCEMENT. You can find a link to the store down below. So let's start with the background of Johnson's speech. In the speech, the Prime Minister endeavoured to give the people of Britain an outline of the government's plans to end the lockdown. But there are 3 things to note before we jump into what Johnson actually said. Firstly, this announcement primarily applies to just England. Each of the other devolved governments, those of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, have their own powers when it comes to the lockdown. So despite Johnson being the Prime Minister for the entirety of the United Kingdom, most of the changes he outlined only applied to England, meaning that the rules now vary depending on where in the UK you find yourself. This led to some criticism, most vocally from Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, that Johnson's announcement and changes could cause confusion for citizens, and the divergence of approaches risks heightening confusion. There's also issues in Wales too, with some criticising the confusion that will be caused on the English-Welsh border, with rules varying as people cross the border for work and schooling. Regardless, keep in mind that most of these changes primarily apply to England. Secondly, this speech is only the first stage of the plan. It was only the briefest of outlines, with the Prime Minister heading to Parliament later today to give a more detailed plan, as well as facing questions from MPs and later in the day from the public. The decision to make this preliminary announcement on Sunday night outside of the Commons was controversial with some, including Speaker Lindsay Hoyle, with some people accusing the government of trying to bypass the democratically elected House, the chamber which, under the British system of government, holds supreme legal authority.
It's been widely reported that the government will make a major announcement this Sunday. It is important that the press is kept informed, but it is the duty of this House to hold the government to account.
Finally, it's important to remember that all of the advice and all of the changes that Johnson makes in this speech are dependent on continued scientific data. The Prime Minister makes it very clear that any changes the government makes will be based on scientific findings, and if the virus isn't under control, the UK will continue to be locked down indefinitely. As such, the government's 5 tests continue to be important. A while ago, the government outlined 5 tests which would need to be passed in order for number 10 to lift the lockdown, something which Johnson goes over in this speech.
Because although we have a plan, it is a conditional plan. And since our priority is to protect the public and save lives, we cannot move forward unless we satisfy the 5 tests. We must protect our NHS. We must see sustained falls in the death rate. We must see sustained and considerable falls in the rate of infection. We must sort out our challenges in getting enough PPE to the people who need it. And last, we must make sure that any measures we take do not force the reproduction rate of the disease, the R, back up over 1.
The most important of these to the government's plans is the virus's rate of reproduction, the so-called R rate. The R rate is the average number of people that an infected person passes the virus onto. Without social distancing or quarantine measures, the average person with coronavirus infects 3 further people, making the R rate 3. However, by implementing lockdown procedures, we're able to reduce this number. We're obviously not making the virus less infectious or changing the nature of the virus itself. We're merely spreading people out. That's super important, because if you're in contact with fewer people, then you have less opportunity to spread the virus. If you continue your daily life as normal, that's when the R rate is 3, with the average person passing the virus onto 3 more people. But if you limit the number of people you come into contact with, your ability to spread the virus falls, and therefore so does the R rate. So far, the UK and many other countries have been able to suppress the virus's spread and get the R rate below 1, and that's super important. If the R rate's below 1, then it means that the average person with the virus spreads it to less than one person. This means that the virus ultimately shrinks, with each successive generation of patients spreading the virus onto fewer and fewer people, until it essentially fades away. So it's incredibly important that the UK keeps the R rate as low as possible, and at the very least, that they keep it below 1, to prevent a further outbreak from occurring. The UK is not alone in this focus though. When Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel announced the country's relaxation of lockdown measures, she put a real focus on the R rate, emphasising how even a slight increase in the R rate could have disastrous consequences. She remarked that if we get to a point where each person is infecting 1.1 people, then by October we'll be back to the limits of our health system in terms of intensive care beds. If we get to 1.2, then we'll hit full capacity of the healthcare system in early July, and if it's 1.3, we'll hit the full capacity of the healthcare system in June. So you can see how little room for manoeuvre we have. We discussed this more in our video over on the TLDR EU channel about Europe's reaction to the virus, and you can find that link below. But the same is true in the UK. Huge focus needs to be placed on keeping the reproduction rate low and limiting spread, because even a slight increase in R rate could have huge consequences. That's why all of Johnson's plan is based on this figure, and if the targets aren't met, the lockdowns won't be stopped. To measure the outbreak and decide if lockdowns can be relaxed, the UK government has developed an alert level ranging from 1 to 5, depending on the virus's spread. Alert level 5, the highest level, means that there's a material risk of the virus overwhelming the NHS, while level 1 means that the virus is no longer present in the UK. The government hasn't made the specifics of the levels clear, or determined what they mean at this stage, but what was highlighted is that the alert level has a very clear link to the virus's spread. Johnson did discuss the current level of infection and the government's objectives related to this.
When I look at where we are tonight, we have the R below 1, between 0.5 and 0.9, but potentially only just below 1. Over the period of the lockdown, we've been in level 4, and it's thanks to your sacrifice we're now in a position to begin to move in steps to level 3. And as we go, everyone will have a role to play in keeping the R down.
So we know that the UK's R rate is below 1, which is a good sign, and meant that the UK could make some changes to the lockdown policy. When it came to making changes to the lockdown proceedings and the loosening of regulations, Johnson outlined 3 steps, each of which will be taken only at certain times, and when the R rate conditions had been met. The first change, set to happen right now, was step 1, which means that from today, those who can't work from home are encouraged to return to work.
We said that you should work from home if you can, and only go to work if you must. We now need to stress that anyone who can't work from home, for instance, those in construction or manufacturing, should be actively encouraged to go to work, and we want it to be safe for you to get to work. So you should avoid public transport if at all possible. Work from home if you can, but you should go to work if you can't. Public transport operators will also be following COVID secure standards.
Many have criticised the government's advice in this area, saying that it's too vague and doesn't make clear enough which businesses can reopen and which employees should be expected to return to work. This follows from concerns raised by unions and business groups last week, when the government published 7 documents on the reopening of businesses. Unions and business groups said that these documents failed to address fundamental questions related to testing, PPE and social distancing. This means that people continue to be concerned about returning to work, and many aren't even sure if they're expected to return to work yet. With Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer telling the BBC that these changes ask as many questions as they answer. On top of the rules for work, Stage 1 also includes the relaxation of advice surrounding exercise from Wednesday. These changes mean that from the middle of the week, people in England will be allowed to travel to exercise and take part in sports with members of their own households, as long as they continue to practice social distancing. Details for the second and third steps were vague, but include the following changes. Step 2 will see the phased reopening of shops, as well as the reopening of some schools. Primary schools will open first, with students in reception Year 1 and Year 6 being the first to return to schooling. Also during this phase, the government will attempt to allow students who have exams next year to spend some time with teachers before the summer holidays begin. Step 3 would involve some of the hospitality industry reopening, such as restaurants and cafes, as long as these businesses are able to continue enforcing social distancing. The problem is that it's not clear when the second or third steps will be taken. You'll notice that the R rate has been conveniently left off the y-axis on the government slides. We do know that the second step won't happen until June 1st at the earliest, and that the third step won't be made any sooner than July 1st. The government's also clearly prioritising minimising the spread and not taking steps until they know that they won't cause a second spike. But that leaves us very short of details. Currently, we only know that the R rate is between 0.5 and 0.9, meaning that the estimates we can make are very imprecise. The graph that the government provides suggests that we're nearer the 0.9 end of the spectrum, but it's still not clear. What we do know is that any hopes of jumping back to normality aren't even close to a reality. The UK continues to take measured steps, and you shouldn't expect any major changes in the short term. Even if the virus is limited as the government hopes, the third step can't happen until July 1st, and it is reliant on the R rate being significantly reduced. This means that the next couple of months will see the lockdown continue broadly intact, even in the best case scenario. And even if we do achieve the third step, that still leaves social distancing in place, and only includes some limited reopenings, so it could be months before the UK returns to a new normal.
And if we're to control this virus, then we must have a world-beating system for testing potential victims and for tracing their contacts.
The government is clearly trying to make this process as smooth as possible to get us through these next two steps along their plan. And they're going to be doing this by increasing testing and rolling out a new contact tracing program. The problem is that testing in the UK has faced endless issues, with the government repeatedly failing to hit their target of 100,000 tests a day. And when it comes to tracing apps, people continue to be very cautious. When we polled them, a majority of our viewers said that they wouldn't install the government's apps, which could prove very problematic for their rollout. I really recommend that you check out our video on the NHS's plan, and how it varies from the one suggested by Apple and Google. You can find our video on the contact tracing apps in the description below. We're expecting more information from the government later today as Johnson speaks to the House of Commons, so stay tuned for updates. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers for making videos like this one possible.